Good morning. I'm Matt Poore with the Amazing Grazing program at NC State University, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about fences with the focus will be electric fence management. We know that fences are extremely important to the implementation of improved grazing management, and there's really no alternative to it in our environment because of the cost of non-electric permanent fencing and the amount of fencing that would be required to create a grazing system without the use of electric fence. So I'm going to share my my presentation with you, and let me get that started. Okay, so I want to credit Johnny Rogers, who's the program coordinator for Amazing Grazing. And we've been doing this fencing work for some time since we really decided that that this was our limiting factor in terms of getting people to adopt better grazing management and reach some of the goals of, for example, the 300-day grazing program in Virginia. So we will run through some basics about electric fence function. I know you're going to get a little bit more detail on that, so I'll be glossing over because of the amount of time I have, but I won't say much at all about permanent fencing. As we've implemented the Amazing Grazing program here in North Carolina and in other places across the region, our successful producers are almost always those that have a good handle on using temporary electric fence. And so we focus a lot of our education on that. Down here, you can see one of our workshops where we do what we call the reel race. And sometimes this is the first time a person has had an electric fence reel in their hand. And after that experience, many of them go ahead to adopt it. It's just that they've never had it. They've never touched it, and they just can't imagine that this kind of technology could work with their cows. And so it's something that we have to overcome, this barrier of adoption of electric fence before we can really implement the good grazing practices that we're all trying to get implemented out there on the land. So again, the best systems that we work with are a combination of really good perimeter fences. Now this slide shows a 4-strand high tensile fence, which is kind of the standard in our area for permanent perimeter fencing. The other options, depending on how populated the area you are or the risk of a potential animal out, you may want to use a woven wire field fence type of fence for your perimeter. That highly recommended being the high tensile type of fence as opposed to the old traditional soft wire field fence. But nevertheless, having that good perimeter and then using temporary to subdivide within those perimeter fences is really the key. Now, I'll stress a few things as we go on, but maintaining a lot of power is critical. And if you think one of these perimeter fences with many strands, there's already a physical barrier there. They've got to kind of weave their way between those wires. So there's somewhat of a physical barrier. It doesn't take nearly as much power to control an animal with that than it does when you have this single strand and it's strictly a mental barrier. So keep that in your mind that our perimeter fence probably needs to have somewhat of a physical barrier attribute to it. But the key to electric fence is that power in that one wire, and I'll return to that concept at the end. So as we think about electric fence and some of the components, let's break that down. So I will say there's two really key points on this slide. First, the energizer, sometimes also called the box or the charger, is the heart to the system. Without enough power coming out of the energizer, you cannot be successful. So we need to make sure that we have plenty of power, and that means probably overpowered in most situations, which I'll mention that. And it's hard to gauge that when you shop energizers, look at different companies. They're tested in different ways, so the exact joule ratings are hard to compare, but nevertheless, they are similar and still the only real guide that we have. There are many good brands of energizers out there. We're looking for a high impedance product, and those tend to be obviously more expensive, but we need to make sure that the farmers are using a very good quality energizer if they're trying to adopt this improved grazing management. So for a small acreage, maybe a 25, 40 acre type farm, probably a 2.5 joules or so is probably enough. And then that can range up to very large energizers that can power very large properties. So understanding how to decide and how to get that is the most important thing. So the rule of thumb I use is 1 joule for somewhere between 10 and 40 acres. So a single joule box can power a 40 acre farm if there's minimal cross fencing and no challenges on the perimeter and that sort of thing. If you have challenges, if you want to have a lot of power, then you probably want 4 joules for that 40 acre property. And so again, it's going to be in that range. The first thing that you need to think about after getting your energizer is make sure that the lightning protection is adequate. This is used to be a very common problem, less common now because the energizers are better, but nevertheless, a well-placed lightning strike on your electric fence line, or on the power line, either one can cause the energizer to be damaged. So you want to make sure that you have your system well grounded, and that's oftentimes something that farmers are neglectful about. That it takes, I've got a really big energizer, a 32 joule on our main property, and it takes 10 ground rods to properly ground that unit. So just because you have 3 ground rods and the manufacturer says a minimum of 3 ground rods, that doesn't mean that's enough. So you have to make sure that's set up. You need to have your electric service very well grounded, and that's something that the electric company will check for you if you feel like you have a problem. And then you need to have lightning protection. We'll end with this. It's such an important point. There's some new products out there on the market, and so a spark gap between the box and the fence is a critical piece of construction. Used to be an induction coil on all of these setups. See a lot of them now made without an induction coil, but that coil between the spark gap and the energizer can help to impede the flow of lightning and bleed more off to the spark gap side. So that may help you in a direct hit. But again, I found there are many cases where that's not necessary. Now, the other components, obviously, when we're talking about permanent, those perimeters, and talking specifically about high tensile here, but it doesn't matter really which it is, but you need to put a ton of effort into the braces. That is the key to the strength of the system and the durability. So we need to make sure that we're doing good bracing, putting the post deep in the ground and making firm H braces. And again, farmers can't perceive that that's necessary. And poorly built permanent fences within less than 10 years usually need extensive renovation. So building these right so that they have a 30-year or longer life is very, very much recommended. Now, one important point on this, and the main one I'll make about posts, is we need to use pulpwood posts in general. You can get peeler core posts. They oftentimes look better when they're new. This is the center of a veneer log, and that the way that veneer is produced, it leaves these peeler cores at the end. They're very symmetrical, very uniform, but because the ring pattern on the tree is not consistent and complete, then they can warp a lot. They can warp, split. They're not as durable as a quote pulpwood post. So ask that question. We want to avoid using steel posts in this new fence construction. Now we'll deal with a lot of farms that have some temporary, they have some T-posts on their perimeter fence. We'll talk about that, but those steel posts are a potential ground, and we need to make sure that we don't design those in early, into the beginning of a system. We also want to use the really good quality insulators. Again, you can get cheap insulators that will last you 4 or 5 years, But once they start to go bad, then you pretty well have to replace all of them if you want to make sure your fence will work. So a big mistake we see, farmers building a temporary fence or a perimeter fence using Tposts and then the cheap yellow insulators. That is just a recipe for disaster 5 to 10 years in to the fence use. In terms of temporary fence, we want to use polywire in most cases for cattle rather than tape, and it's plenty visible for them. Now for horses, we probably want to use tape, and because of visibility. And we have plenty of situations where polywire controls horses, but from a caution standpoint, the industry does recommend tape for use in horses. We need to make sure that we're using good quality polywire. I like the 9-strand stainless, but also mixed metal products now out there. 6-strand are very effective, and I know you'll probably hear more about that from some of the manufacturers. We want to use a good quality reel. Most cases geared reels, but not always. And then we want to make sure that when we are making big, long stretches of temporary fence, that we do something to to stabilize those ends. So temporary corner stretch posts, we like to use little fiberglass 11/16 or 5/8 or 7/8 type posts for that application. Now this is a picture of an H brace. Again, those of you from NRCS Soil and Water know all about how these are designed and what the specs are. But this would be one that would be built to specs for cost share programs. Post 3 feet in the ground, an 8-foot post, 10-inch wire spacing with an 18 inches off the ground. I really like this elevated lower wire, especially for cattle farms, because it helps you with the brush and such growing into your fence. Now, one thing to mention, you might want to leave the bottom wire not hot, depending on your situation. That's up to your decision. But if you don't have trouble with cattle getting out, you can have that. If you have sheep, goats, or whatever, you're obviously going to need another wire below that, or use some sort of a field fence or whatever for your perimeter. Now, a less expensive type brace to build is a bed log brace. And again, for a 3-wire or less fence, and sometimes for using on our cross fencing, this type of brace works just fine. It involves, I like to, this is a slight angle away from the direction of the pull. I like to tamp a rock down at the bottom of that post to give it a very firm seat at the bottom. Then we tamp that in, and about 6 inches below the sole surface, we put a quote bed log. This would be another piece of a treated post. Could be a large rock or whatever, but the key is you fit that in tightly into a little trench there, Doug, and that gives you additional resistance to the pulling over of this post. So between that and the base rock, that gives you a real good strong post. Now these both show dug posts. Obviously, you can drive these. If you drive a bed log brace, you don't have the opportunity to put the base rock at the bottom, but certainly you can install that bed log, and then you have a very strong brace. Now we see a lot of other things done out there in practice, and again, farmers are pretty creative. This kind of a setup can work. This is being a corner. This being a line post. This isn't an area where there's so much rock you can't really get a post in the ground with any reliability at all. And so this farmer went ahead and used this type fence. Understand, this takes a lot of maintenance. So while it seems easy and cheap at the time, it will take a lot of maintenance, both because of the trees potentially dying and falling, branches falling, and then also the durability of these insulator type arrangements. But nevertheless, a good hot wire here, and that can do you a lot of good if that's how you want to get it implemented. So brings me to a point here. We have an educational challenge with this because although we talk about the importance of this, we show, we know that a lot of people are using it. There's many more producers that don't have a good handle on temporary fence. They say, well, it won't work for my cattle. They tear it down. The deer around my place tear it down. I just can't use this temporary fence. We hear that a lot. We've never found a case where we couldn't go out there and troubleshoot it and help the farmer get established. This particular field, this was a field day. We were gathering at a farmer's farm that we'd worked with for many years, and he had abandoned electric temporary fence, much to our surprise. We went out and started talking about doing a field day out there. And so we started analyzing his system and found he did not have sufficient power to control cattle, and he really didn't have enough power to convince his deer to learn to avoid electric fence. So if you have inadequate power, things just won't work out. So in this case, we set up a fence here. It's a little bit in the distance here, but you can see one of these 7/8 fiberglass posts, a pretty close spacing here on the tread-in posts, and 2 wires. And this was because he had calves. We put a solar energizer on this the day that we were out there and helped him set it up. And he since then went ahead and upgraded his energizer, so he has plenty of power, doesn't have any problem anymore. Once the cows were trained to this, he was able to go to a single strand. The deer quit tearing it down, and he's been very successful at re-implementing that. So just a matter of just enough power to really keep the animals trained. And this will show you kind of what I was talking about. This is one of those 7/8 fiberglass posts available from several different companies carry these, SunGuard or some way UV stabilized type post. And this, we like to use these especially in challenging situations or with beginning farmers because it gives you a little bit of stability. If a deer hits, it will help to hold that up. You see a light driver and then some more of these posts and reels and stuff. And I like to keep this out in the field with me when I'm daily moving or whatever. I can have those tools there with me when I need them. And this kind of an approach can really help you. Now, when you get into some super challenging stuff, you may have to do some things like run some wire. You may have to, run a bush hog and clear a path. You may have to run it down with your vehicle or whatever, but certainly, it's very possible to do some very interesting stuff with this. And the key to me is the control. So here where we have excellent control on the fence, excellent power, a well-trained group of cows, they clean up and then they just stand there and wait for you. You see these cows are not upset. They're very, they're just patiently waiting. And as one thing, I'm not going to talk about grazing management much today, but if you move animals daily, this is what you find. They are they very much get into the rhythm of the day. They know what they're going to do. They know you're going to come give them some grass, and they're not anxious about it at all, even though they very clearly, completely utilized what was in that previous paddock for them. So again, back to our challenge as educators in this area, getting the temporary fence into people's hands and helping them to be successful is a key. And so we do a lot of these on-farm workshops where we actually work with the farmer to implement grazing, oftentimes during the winter. We provide them with some supplies, with reels, posts, and then help them to get that established. They work with their agent, their local NRCS person to implement all of that. And then at the end of the demonstration, they're able to keep that equipment if they followed through and had the workshop, which we've never had anybody fail that commitment. So this is a way you can really get this stuff into the field. You can get a lot of farmers to see it because they'll come see their neighbors doing something like this. And until we see this regularly going down the highway or the road, until people start to realize this is part of what you can do, this is part of what is regularly done, then we have to make sure that we continue to plant this seed, teach people how to be effective, and spread the word. And so hopefully that's what this training is all about. Talk briefly about alternative livestock species, and Johnny Rogers is our expert on this because he's had a lot of experience over his career fencing for sheep, goats, pastured hogs, and pastured poultry. And the concepts are the same, while some of the challenges with the type of wire you would use here, using electronet type wire. That is a product that is very useful for these small ruminants, both from a predator and a control standpoint, and obviously for the poultry, protection against predators is a key aspect of using that electric fence. Now let's talk for a second about different types of fence, and I mentioned earlier the polytape versus the versus polywire. And we have we just need to make sure that you get what you pay for on this, and there's very few 6-strand polywire stainless that actually are effective enough for most farms. Very small farms maybe, but for a significant stretch, that's not enough. You have too much resistance in the wire. And so we want to move to something like a 9-strand polywire or a mixed metal polywire that will have a lot less resistance. And again, refer to that as you kind of advise people on what fence to buy. We do say in our specs a minimum of 9-strand stainless polywire, if not a mixed metal with less resistance than that. Now, with the small ruminants, it's not one wire, it's multiple wires. And so a few wire arrangements here. If you really need super good control, if you have animals that you're just starting or whatever, then an arrangement like this with 5 strands might be recommended. But eventually, many of the small ruminants can be controlled with 3 strands of wire, and again, a little bit more challenging to keep them in. You have to be a little bit more on top of your grazing management. If they get hungry, they will get out. Here's some spacing options. Basically, this is fairly low cost compared to the electronet, but it does not offer very good predator control. So onto that net fence, and I just wanted to put this slide in because it reminds me of how we gauge also our fixed knot fence for perimeters. But the numbers, when this is presented like this, 9 means it's got 9 horizontal strands, 35 means it's 35 inches tall, and 12 means that it's 12 inches between the vertical strands. So that's the way all of the net fence and woven wire fencing is marketed, and so that's something to keep in mind. There's a lot of options for electronet. And one thing to keep in mind, it is heavy. So it may seem to be, tempting to get the longer one. It's potentially, a little less expensive, and maybe you think, well, that's going to give me more, and I can make a bigger fence with less work. Well, it's heavy, so you might get tired of that and want the shorter loops. Just keep that in mind. And the net fence, it's one thing. It's you got to learn. It takes a whole extra learning curve to use it effectively. You want to. It's easy if you follow the directions, but make sure that you fold it up correctly. You do need to control tall forage. It's very easy to short this out. Wooded areas are a real challenge. But it does give you super predator control from ground predators. Now, obviously, hawks can get in. You will have some entanglement issues with lambs and kids. Most farmers with small ruminants have lost an animal or two this way, and so it's important to keep that net electrified all the time, because if it's not electrified, they will stick their head through it, get tangled. And then that can be a problem. If it's hot, they can be shocked multiple times. If not, they can still strangle and get tangled in it. So make sure that you keep a close eye on this if you're using electronet. Now, I want to turn a little bit now to troubleshooting, because this is one of the areas. Once you have an electric fence operating, it's going to be very important to monitor it for power. Some of the energizers will give you all kinds of little keys that you can use to monitor the power on the fence, but there's nothing like using a tester and some pre-identified places where it's easy to check the fence and make sure that you know what your performance should be, so that you identify when it's not working properly. And I'll just mention here, this is not a brace built spec for cost share by any means. These are really tiny posts. It can be effective. You can do all sorts of things with electric fence if you have enough power, but for goodness sakes, corners, H braces should be built out of heavy enough posts to prevent them from breaking just by an animal accidentally getting pushed into it or accidentally bumped with a vehicle or whatever. You don't want those to break your posts. So let's talk about troubleshooting scenarios, because again, I think this is where we get people to adopt, and then they can't keep power on their fence. And then you get the worst case scenario, which is they quit. And then they think it can't work for me because I've tried it. So we have to know how to help them with their troubleshooting issues. So let's talk about a couple of scenarios. One, maybe you just consistently have low power on the fence. You just can't keep it up where we know it needs to be. Scenario two, maybe we have frequent lightning damage. That's another problem. And scenario three that we hear a lot of, the deer just constantly tear it down. I can't use it because I have too many deer. Well, all of these problems could be from an insufficient energizer. That would be my first thing to check. Could be because of vegetations and shorts on the fence, a poor ground, or probably in situations where we've been out to. It's all of these. And so we need to really, again, stress building the system right to begin with, but then knowing what to look for when you go to troubleshoot. And again, all of these are potentially a problem. So again, a few comments on energizers. I'll quote myself from earlier, 1 joule for 10 to 40 acres, depending on the expected conditions. We want to keep at least 5 kilovolts on the fence during good conditions for cattle and 7 for small ruminants. Now that's higher than you might have heard in another presentation like this, but let me explain myself. The minimum needed to control various animals, horses are very sensitive, less than 3 kilovolts. Cattle, about 3 kilovolts in most situations will effectively control cattle. Sheep and goats takes about 5. And deer and wildlife takes maybe a lot more than that. We don't totally understand that part of it. And obviously deer that runs from another farm onto yours because being chased by dogs is always in danger of tearing down fence. But your local deer and wildlife will learn to avoid it. So let's just keep in mind, we're not really fencing for what we're raising. We're fencing for deer. So again, that goal of keeping above 5 all the time. Now, the other reason for that is that when you are challenged, let's say you have a rainstorm or whatever, there's always going to be some wet weeds on the fence draining it. And if you keep 5 in good conditions, chances are it's going to be plenty hot even when you have those challenging changes in the weather. Again, Tposts and this being a offset wire here, or not offset enough. And this is a direct opportunity for a ground. So when we're building fence, think about this. Don't when you add one on to a barbed wire like this, that's okay. Strongly recommend using the outriggers or offset type wire so that it's far away from those posts and that wire, because in a setting like this, you see the T-post with the yellow insulator, lots of things done bad. But here, a deer went through the fence, got it tangled up, and completely killed the fence. Because if you think about how good a short this is a whole bunch of ground rods connected by metal wire. I mean, this is a super ground system. Now, it's not strongly recommended, but we do have farmers that use a perimeter barbed wire like this as their ground system for a battery charged energizer that they move around the farm, and that seems to work. It's a little bit unconventional, but all kinds of things are done when farmers get involved. We need to make sure also that we are careful about old fences. When this barbed wire starts to break, that's a real common cause of a short on a fence with an offset wire. And then when we make wires real low to the ground, those can be potential problems, especially in that challenging weather. So don't use T-posts in your new construction. Stay away from barbed wire if at all possible. And there's just very few energizers. It's hard to size one to overcome this sort of a challenge. This completely knocked out this 5 joule energizer that's on a 40-acre farm. Now, and the biggest challenge in the long term is our maintenance of vegetation. So this is a big investment, and we know that it should receive proper maintenance. Obviously, we spot check these on cost share projects and find oftentimes the notice says, well, you need to control the vegetation on your fence. Fences need to be tightened as needed, but not to be too tight. And this is something that a lot of farmers want these just tight as a guitar string, but that puts a lot of pressure on your corners. And so in the interest of the whole system, keeping the tension about where it will be so that it doesn't sag without being that guitar string tight is probably what's appropriate. We need to keep the insulators repaired. Keep some with you. Don't hesitate to switch them out when you see something cracked or broken. And then control vegetation to be sure that you prevent, especially brush and woody species. We want to kill or suppress that grass underneath the fence. And we can use hand labor to do that on a very small farm. That makes sense, especially if it's an organic farm. But if they can use herbicides, having a good herbicide mix can work with that. Vegetation is just a huge drain during wet conditions, so we can't overemphasize it. And a situation like this, a really nice fence, put a lot of money, a lot of effort into making a good installation. And then because of the challenging environment, this grows up. So keeping these mowed on both sides if possible and sprayed annually is probably the best maintenance thing that we can recommend. Now, we get a lot of questions about what do we spray with. If you want to use glyphosate, a 2% solution will give you good control of pretty much everything. The only problem, it will give you bare ground. And so once you get down to grass, you can use a suppressive dose. 0.25% solution will suppress grass growth. Won't kill anything or very few things, but it will give you some control without that bare ground. Now, once if you've got brush or those kinds of challenges, what we found actually is that using a Tricopure product, Remedy is the most common one that we use, and a 0.5% Remedy and 0.25% Grazing Next is a formula that actually works extremely well for this brushy control on fence rows. And so think about that. It's not quite as expensive and a very, very effective combination. But this depends on the species and the situation. So again, we see people let them grow up. We see people that nuke them with glyphosate twice a year, and somewhere in between is the best approach. Now, one thing that I will say is we want to make sure that we do not spray the glyphosate directly on wire. And this is the reason. There's a lot of data here. This came from John Bird at Mississippi State University. But if you go down here to the Roundup products, straight Roundup, you'll see pH is in the 4s. And that is just corrosive to galvanized fence. And so when you put a acid product on a galvanized fence, it eats away the zinc and will eventually cause corrosion. So as you spray that, It's very important to direct that spray at the ground level or at the weeds, not on the wire if you can avoid it. Again, another advantage for having that elevated ground wire, 18 inches up, it will help you to minimize this. But just direct the sprayers appropriately so that you are not just dousing that high tensile wire every time you spray. Now I want to spend a little time on lightning protection. There's a lot of lightning gadgets out there that can help you. Again, nothing that can overcome a poorly grounded fence. So we'll talk about how to check ground in a minute, but make sure your fence is grounded. This is the older type of lightning diverter. There's actually a spark gap inside this porcelain unit, so that it's one end goes to the ground and one end goes to the fence. So if and when lightning strike runs in on the fence wire, it comes to this unit. It's able to jump across the spark gap and get some of that lightning to ground before it goes on to the Energizer. So again, a very important concept that we bleed off some of this before it gets to the Energizer. Now, the problem with these is if you take the back off and you look at it, you'll see how it works, but you can't see. It's a sealed unit, and sometimes this can get damaged inside from a lightning strike, and so you don't necessarily know that it's not working. That can be a problem for you, obviously. Now, some time ago, a friend of mine that we used to work with a lot on electric fence taught us how to build these homemade spark gaps. This would be the lead out wire going to the Energizer, and here it is going to the fence. This side is in this wire goes to the ground. And again, this is installed between the fence system and the Energizer, between the fence and the induction coil if you're using an induction coil on your fence. But basically, this does the same thing as that, without the damage, and with you being able to see what's going on. So you'll be able to adjust this spark gap to the power of your fence by disconnecting the fence and then spreading this until it no longer arcs. And then you've got a place where that lightning can jump, and oftentimes this is plenty to save your Energizer. Some other ones out here. A Gallagher spark gap unit, similar to this concept, just a sealed unit. It's adjustable and works quite well. And then there are others out there on the market. This one has an induction coil built into it. Anything you do is going to help. You might want multiple protections in your system, but certainly a spark gap somewhere between the fence and the Energizer is strongly recommended. Now, I'll just go back up and say, it's very common to have the lightning come in on the power side. So if that's the case, it's that your service is not grounded properly, and you need to make sure that is done either by your electrician or the power company. And if it's your side of the service, then your electrician needs to fix it. If it's on the pole side, if the pole's not grounded well, the transformer there, it will cause lots of problems. So that's something to check up on, especially if you're at the end of a run where there's no other customers down there. You may have a bad ground and they not realize it. Now, testers have greatly improved. And when I started working with this technology 40 years ago, these top two were basically all you could get. I was farming a while before the digital voltmeter came out, that at least gives you a little better reading than just the lights on or off, or the 5 light. How high does this go? This one will give you the readout of the power on the fence, and so this was a big improvement when this came out. However, today our real ambitious farmers should be using a tester that can also track amperage or measure for leaks in the system. And so these fault finders, most of the companies make one. Gallagher, stay fixed, Kinko. They're all work similarly. They identify not only how many volts are on the fence, but how much power is flowing past you at a given point. And so this becomes extremely important in being able to identify and find those shorts that we talked about. So, let me tell you a little bit more about this. Is a stay fixed model, but it's basically the same in all the others. The voltage shows the potential energy on the fence, the volts, the amperage, the big number here with the little capital A. This is the amount of flow that is flowing past you on the fence. Now, if you have your polarity set up correctly on the tester, then the little arrow here will tell you which way the power is flowing past you. That can sometimes not be set properly and can be misleading. So I generally use my knowledge of which way the power must be flowing. But if you can get your polarity set right, then it'll tell you which way that power is flowing. Now, the problem is I have seen situations where it flowed down one wire, went to the tie between the strands of wire, and then came back. And so it flowed this way on that wire and this way on that wire. And so it can get kind of confusing trying to track these shorts, but certainly better than just walking and looking. So we've spent a lot of time teaching this to our extension agents and our CS folks all around the state of North Carolina and beyond, to try to get folks used to the concept of how do you use these things. Because we found that actually when you go out to troubleshoot with a farmer, if you know how to use this, you can pretty quickly identify some major shorts and help them get a lot more power on their fence right away. So very important teachable moment is when you go out and that farmer says, I just can't keep power, come help me. Well, this is the way you figure out what's going on. So let me run you through a scenario here that that will make us perhaps think about how we might use this. This is the situation you may be presented with, and I want to set you up here. Here's the Energizer, this little oval here at the top. We have the X is our switch to the fencing system. We have one ground rod set up here. And what we find is we've got 3.4 kilovolts, not that 5 that I'm shooting for. We've got about 6 amps flowing out the fence. But as we tested in different places, the voltage drops very slowly, the amps drop very slowly, and that just means there's about, there's a little bit of leakage as we go through weeds and that sort of thing. And this is real common, but obviously inadequate power. So what's the problem? I think you'll say right away, well, one ground rod. There's not a good Energizer made that says you can use one ground rod, and now. Sometimes that's done with the portable units, but it's generally not adequate to give you a good enough ground. So in this case, we go and we check that by creating a bad short on the fence. And I usually use a couple T-posts stobbed in the ground, laid up on the wire. You really can get a good crack out of it. It may, if you reduce the power down to 1.5, that's probably good. But then what you want to do is go around and check the power on the ground rod. And if there is voltage on the ground rod, it means you don't have enough ground. So again, combination of creating this short and going ahead and realizing, okay, I have power on the ground rod. That's the best indicator. So again, if you show up to a farm, one of the first things to check, it's easy to do this, create a short, go check the ground system. If it's got power on it, you've got some place to start. So put the 3 ground rods recommended. We short the fence out as we do this, and that last ground rod says 0 kilovolts. That's what we want. So then go back and look at the performance of the fence. 5.4, slowly declining as we would expect. A few amps, again, that little bit of background leak going on. A much more effective fence now ready to go, simply because we replaced that. We put more ground rods. Okay. New situation. Same fence. Got the ground right now, but we come and we find that we have no power, low power, and this had a lot of power on it the day before. Okay, so we know there's a short out there somewhere. What we can do is we can go to where the wire, the lead out wire goes to the fencing system, and start using our fault finder to see where we have flow. So we check this side of the switch, and we find we have no amps and 2.8 kilovolts. This side of the switch, we got 30 amps. So over here you go, you check it and it goes beep, 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 everything's regular. Go over here, beep, 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 you've got a short, okay? So so we know that because this is not a complete loop, and this is, again, one of the points, design points. If you leave it as an open loop, you can check it a lot better, because if you have a short down here and this is tied together in a loop, you'll have power flowing both ways. And that's going to really cause you a lot of challenges. So we continue down the fence. Maybe this goes through brush or wherever it goes. You don't have to check it everywhere. You just walk down the fence and check. See, we still got our 30 amps here. That's not it. We got to keep going. Go back here and 2 amps. Okay, we passed it. So we just work our way back towards the last place that we tested it. Testing it at various places. And if you're driving, you just drive and stop, check it here, and drive and stop, check it here. And what we find is, disappear here in a second. Go back a little farther, check it again. Same reading, a little bit more amps, but we still obviously are past it. Go up here, still haven't passed it. Check it again a little closer, and we find there it is. Okay, so so this helps you to work through where the shorts are. Now, when you go out, I'll just tell you, you go out, you start troubleshooting one of these, what you're going to find is they got shorts everywhere. So this will lead you to the worst short pretty quickly. Once you get it off, you'll find you don't have much more power. You got shorts everywhere. So you keep tracking them, and you know, one good session, one good day, you can really find lots of shorts and get a lot better performance out of that fence. Then we fix it, and voila, everything is as it should be. So we will, you know, we'll have a chance in the live session to go through some of this with a hands-on demo. But just to get you started thinking about this important part of this. So we want to make sure that when we design, that we're setting it up so that it's easy to check. And this is one of the things I've had to do with my fencing system at home. Ours was built with the strands tied together at both ends of a stretch. These little blue ovals being the insulators, a jumper wire here going from one section of the fence to the next. And as I say, it used to be we designed these tied together on both ends, and that's so that the flow can go through all the wires, and it's only briefly in this single wire situation. Now, what that does is that it hurts your ability to troubleshoot, because if you have a ground right here, for example, it is possible for there to be some flow down this wire or down this wire, down to the lower wire, and then back. And that can get really, really confusing. So unless you have a really huge system where this multi-strand lead out is important, and there are situations where it is important, but in our most of our smaller applications, it's far easier to not tie together that far end away from the Energizer, so that you can identify where is the flow. The flow is going to be in this wire, and it makes it relatively easy to check without having a lot of backflow on your system. So in summary, these well-managed electrical fence systems are very critical to improving grazing management. We want to keep high power on the fence, and that's the key to success. And we want to do our best during the construction of these to minimize these future problems. Things like designing with Tposts is really a mistake. And we want to learn to troubleshoot problems and teach our producers how to check their system, because again, success with this means you periodically check your fence and you correct the power problems when they happen. If you wait till animals are out to check the power, you'll always have animals get down. You need to Have it strong each time they encounter it, even when it's accidental. Now, I want to run through one last thing. And again, I started with kind of talking about how one of our constraints or one of our barriers in implementing improved grazing, implementing 300 days grazing, amazing grazing, adaptive grazing, regenerative grazing, whatever you want to call it. It's a matter of getting them to pick that reel up and start and realize this is something I've got to be doing. So we've come up with the idea of a power of one wire, and I just encourage you to search on that. There's a really good little guide to a little fact sheet on that on our Amazing Grazing webpage. But the idea here is to get farmers to realize all I have to do is start using this in small applications. So training animals in a small pen by putting this around the perimeter is an important first key. But then splitting those pastures one time as you go around in your normal sort of rotation is critical. So getting them to think about, okay, all I need to do is to maybe use one of these fiberglass posts. That's what the white implies there, so that you've got a good point to stretch to. We put up that first strand, pull the reel, and then pull it to the side of the water, the blue being the water tank. And you see the cow up here, symbolic of your herd. Set that up, let her in. You know, they may come over here and encounter that wire. If they've been trained, they'll come to it pretty slowly. They're not trained, they may run through it. You'll have to put it back up. It's better to train them in a small area, a small pen or something, before you challenge them with it in the field like this. But nevertheless, this will give them some space. They're not going to be real confined and crowded, and they will start to learn about that. Then again, very easy. We know that this works. Once you start going down towards that reel, the cows are going to follow you. You can open that up. They will go right through, right past you. And again, you're standing here at this white point. And so you've watched every cow walk past you. You've checked their eyes. You've checked their feet. You know who's slow. You know who's the leader cow. And that really gives you some incredibly powerful management information that we would not get if we just had them in this pasture without the wire. Put it back up behind them so they still have access to the water, and you have created a rotational grazing system. So what this has done, it's doubled our stock density, improving our manure distribution, all of that. It increases the rest period for the pasture we're now off of. We've learned to use temporary fence, and your livestock have also started to learn it and being trained to this temporary fence. This we want to try to figure out how we can start people slowly. This is something you can make this work in nearly every farm, and most farmers that start with this kind of thing will go on. And so again, getting getting a grant for some of these supplies, so you can work with farmers to supply them with the basic equipment, and then get them to show their neighbors is something we strongly recommend, and we've had really good success with. Now, one last point on this: once you start using this, there's all kinds of places where it's helpful. And we like it both for sorting cattle, and there's some discussion about that on that Power of One Wire handout. But in the working pen is one of the best places where, this is my pen at home, and used to be we had a hard time getting cattle through this gate. We had to get a crew. Basically, took about 4 people to effectively cut off a group of calves and put them on up into the lead up pen here. Whereas now I can do that alone, or we can do it with just 2 people. I'm on the reel and taking the photo. This is my nephew. And these animals are so conditioned to that electric fence, even though it's not on here. It's not, I mean, look, he's holding on to it. It's not hot. They don't know that, or they don't, even if they touch it and it's not hot, they don't touch it again because they're afraid it'll be hot the second time. They are well-trained animals. And this can really help with the stress in cattle working. And there they go. So again, encourage you, search for the Power of One Wire if you haven't seen this. Again, how do we get people that have not used this or have given up on this to go back and use it? And we hope that some of these kinds of things will be more important to them maybe than their pasture utilization, which obviously is the primary benefit. Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off. I appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this 300 days grazing program in Virginia. This is part of a bigger project that we have with Southern SARE on electric fencing management and troubleshooting. And so again, look forward to seeing you at some of the outdoor events in Virginia, and perhaps you'll see some other amazing grazing personnel if I'm not there. So thank you much. I will stop this and